she felt she didn't want to come contaminate us here, so Mark and I decided that maybe I could possibly do this and throw it together in a hurry. With the Lord's grace, I hope. I had no idea at the time what the readings were about. And talk about strange coincidences, and if you want the grace that I spoke about last week, several weeks ago, we just found out that a beloved daughter-in-law has passed away. And so all this reading about death and life is very, very personal to Jean and I. The three readings, and in fact, even to some extent the psalm, blends in very nicely together in this theme of life and death. As a preacher, there's a couple of things that you try to do, even for a person as myself who just fills in now and then. You try to present the readings, the gospel readings and the Old and New Testament readings, in somewhat of a new light, looking at it from a different angle perhaps, and hopefully finding something that the people can take away. In the Old Testament reading, we have an odd situation happening. One of those things, almost like Balaam's donkey talking, that we say, oh, did this really happen? Whether or not God picked up Ezekiel and physically brought him and dropped him in this valley is not the important thing. It could have been just a vision in his sleep. The important thing in this reading is that God is showing Ezekiel this idea of resurrection. Here are all these dead, dry bones. And yet, almost like in a science fiction scene, you see them all start coming together and coming to life. The word prophesy is used several times. Now, I was always under the impression that a prophet was a person who spoke about the future. But if you look at the dictionary in the back of your pew Bibles, you find out that a prophet is simply a person who speaks God's words. Therefore, to prophesy is simply speaking God's words. It's being God's mouthpiece, so to speak. And what God is telling in this conversation back and forth between God and Ezekiel is a twofold thing. As usual in the Old Testament, there's a big focus upon Israel. Israel, the country, but Israel also the center of what's going to become the huge world church that we think of as Christianity. Secondly, of course, and probably more important in a way, is the theme of life and death. Notice, first of all, everything comes together, and here are these bodies laying there, and actually standing there, but there's no life in them. They're almost like zombies. And then, life is breathed into them. It's a resurrection. Now, we right now are in the 5th week of Lent. There's only a couple more, one more, and then it's Easter. Obviously, resurrection is what we're talking about here. It's in the air. It's what we're breathing. Death followed by life again. Of course, that's our hope as Christians. We're born to die. And yet, through our belief in Jesus Christ, we hope to come back. We hope that he will, through his death for us on the cross, earn us salvation and bring us back to life. Paul, good old Paul, the spirit and the flesh again, as he usually does, that's his combination of things. He's not saying, you have to totally deprive yourself of things, but he is saying that you have to have the spirit take precedence over things of the flesh. And then, of course, Lazarus and Jesus' dealings with that family. There's several things in there kind of hidden that don't instantly pop up to mind as you read through this particular long gospel. Obviously, there's an interplay going on here between Jesus and especially Martha. It's very interesting that, just before that, I'm getting ahead of myself, as I said, I didn't have time to practice this much and think about it too much. Thomas down there in verse 16. Thomas says, let us go and die with him. Now, we all know Thomas, and in just a few weeks, Thomas is going to be the one who, after Jesus rises, is not there when Jesus appears to most of the disciples. And Thomas is very hard-headed, and he says, no, 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 I'm not going to believe this. You didn't see Jesus. He's dead. We actually were going to go die with him. And then, of course, Jesus appears to him the second time when he's gathered that way and says, Thomas, come over here. Put your fingers in my palm and put your hand in my side. And Thomas's response is, Jesus, I believe, help my disbelief. And we see almost the same thing reflected here with Martha. At one point, she really, probably, hopefully, in the back of her mind, is thinking that maybe Jesus will raise Lazarus right now from the dead. There's this interplay back and forth about, well, you know, I believe in the resurrection. I know he'll die on the last day. If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. But let me just see if I can find that exact one that I want. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Even now, I know that God will give you what you ask of him. She is imploring him to raise Lazarus right now. But then it goes on again, and you know your brother will rise again, and it continues on from there. So it's just this hint, like this little tantalizing maybe kind of thing. Lazarus himself, and what happens after, after his death, I should say, because I'm getting kind of a little bit beyond the reading here. If you continue reading this particular section from John, just a few lines later, some of those Jews, as it said at the end of this reading, some of the Jews were amazed, impressed, and actually received enough grace to say, this man is very special. But some others, the little snide, ratty types, ran back to Jerusalem as fast as their little feet could carry them and reported to the Pharisees, he just did this. And at that moment, although Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the dead, he in effect has signed his own death warrant. Because it's from that moment that they really intensify their plot to kill Jesus. And of course, in a week or so, they will. So we got life and death. It's this balance again. He saved somebody, but on the other hand, he's condemning himself. Of course, he knows he's going to rise again. But it's this constant life and death balance back and forth. We, as Christians, have to believe. It's, as Paul would say, it's the foundation of our faith. If Christ did not rise, then this is all useless. This is nothing. We shouldn't have bothered. We should go join some other religion. But we, deep in our hearts, do believe in the resurrection. Now, as I mentioned, Jean and I just found out about the death of a beloved daughter-in-law. As people, as humans, we can't help but be saddened when death happens. Most of you are in an age where you have lost, no doubt, your parents, or at least one parent, perhaps a spouse, hopefully not a child. So we all have gone through this grief thing. We process grief in different ways, at different speeds. You know, psychologists tell us there's a whole series of steps we need to go through. Some people go through those steps in just a few days. Others take years. And some need psychiatric help to get through some of the final steps of it. We have to believe that when a person passes on, when they leave Earth, we don't know the situation. We can hope, we can pray that in their life they have been touched by the grace that they need for Christ to save them. But we don't know this. We hope it. We see people who have lived great lives, and we're more or less assured they're in heaven. Other people we wonder about. But again, going back to what's coming up in just a week or two, the good thief. Here's a man who all his life has done bad. And then at the last minute, he snatches salvation. The last minute, the last second, he's dying. And he snatches salvation. So we never know. It's not for us as humans to know. It's also not for us to know as humans what might happen if the person hadn't died and it continued on. You know, you get some young person that dies and you wonder, well, you know, gee, they didn't have a chance to get married and have children and do this and do that. But God knows more than we do about these things. Our vision is limited. You know, what might have happened to that person, rather than those good things that we're picturing, is, you know, they could have got married. And there could have been a marital dispute and they could have killed their spouse. You know, we never know. We have to rely on faith to tell us this is God working. God knows what he's doing a lot better than we do. I mean, somebody as unreligious as Shakespeare realized that life is just a passing phase. You know, we strut upon the stage as mere actors. He saw that. He realized that life is very finite, very limited, and it's going to come to an end. People in that day, and even today, many people feel, well, what did they accomplish? What was their result? Why is the world better for them having been here? But God doesn't always judge things that way. God doesn't see it that way. God has plans for each of us. And whatever those plans might be, it's up to him to carry them out. Leaving us sometimes, often, most of the time, grieving. But we'll pass through our grief. You know, time heals all. We pass through our grief and resurrection. I remember when my own father passed. He died on a Halloween morning of all days. But the next Easter, I don't know why, but I was just filled with this feeling of, he's saved. He's in heaven. So perhaps the next time we have to deal with death, and we're going to be dealing with it symbolically here in a week or two with Holy Week, try to think of our own cases where we have dealt with death and how we responded and how the others around us respond. We know that we don't live in a world that's filled with all kinds of people who are of faith. There are many people who are atheistic or agnostics, and they don't see this kind of thing. They don't understand why we could almost celebrate a person's life. And notice how more and more they're doing that at funerals. It's a celebration of the person's life. It's not a black draped casket. It's a celebration of a person's life in white, quite often. Because people are starting to understand this idea that it's what the person did during their life and hopefully what's going to happen because of that afterwards. But it's all back on grace and it's all back on God. We don't know. We have no choice in the matter. We have to simply believe. And I think at that point we will end this particular rather lengthy thing. Okay.